so in that sense, when we are not really concerned about the genealogy of moral. It's not something that we really think about, but rather what is important for a Buddhist practitioner is the teleology of moral, whether there is any purpose to them, whether there is any role. And when we question or investigate the purpose or the role, that we need a goal, then we need a context. And that's one of the main differences between Buddhist practice and philosophy, and Western philosophy. That we don't ask completely abstract questions like whether what is morality and what is it for, without having set for ourselves a certain context, a goal. And in the case of Buddhism, that context or goal is a belief in mental health in this present life, and Nibbana as a cosmological, sociological, or emancipatory experience. That belief, the belief that there is an emancipatory scenario that is possible, that is experienceable for human beings, and that there is a certain definition of mental health in this present life. This is our context, and this is our goal. And that, of course, requires belief. You have to believe in that, and you have to be interested in that in order for your thought and for your investigation to take that as a reference and as a context in relation to which you investigate such questions as what is morality and what is it for. But for us, if that context doesn't exist, then the question becomes really just an entertainment for the mind, an occasion to indulge in opinion and in conceptual possibility. You cannot settle a question like that without having a context or a goal in mind. This really is one of the most significant differences between Buddhist thinking or Buddhist investigation, Buddhist thought, Buddhist wisdom, and Western one. In Western thought, it is actually discouraged to begin with a belief in a goal or a belief in a context, and it is believed that only through investigation, abstract investigation, could that goal and that context eventually develop. So only when you sit down and contemplate morality, for example, morality, many other things too, abstractly and conceptually, somehow you might eventually reach some conclusion about what is it and what is it for, and whether it is relevant or significant or not. But for Buddhists, it's the exact opposite of that. You can only understand and examine morality, for example, or other things too, only when you have a goal in mind, or only when you can relate it to a certain purpose, to a certain context. And again, that context for Buddhist is a certain standard of mental health and a certain belief in the possibility of emancipation of the conscious. And when we do that in the case of morality, we find it quite easy to come to a decisive conclusion about what morality is for. That's why we're not even concerned about where does it come from, what's its origin, what is it for, and how can it be used. Can it be actually appropriated to serve the goal and the context that we have in mind? And it is only in that sense that we can see whether it is relevant or whether it is useful or not. And in this way, we could say that the Buddha's approach the Buddhist approach to a question like morality or an issue like morality is a practical one and also a psychological one. It is one that is based on observation and that is based on finding out its potential and capacity to serve a certain standard of mental health and a cosmological emancipation. And these things are actually, of course, very relevant. Like when I speak about Buddhist standards, the definition of mental health is really something that has to do with our human experience in this very present life. But very naturally, this standard and definition of mental health is also directly related to the Buddha's cosmological understanding and experience of liberation of mind and liberation of being and liberation of consciousness in cosmological terms. These things are so tightly related. But I make that distinction between mental health and the cosmological liberation because the Buddha's teaching and the Buddha's experience of the mastery of the mind and the liberation of the mind is still very relevant and useful to those who are interested in psychology and in mental health, independently from any belief or concern about cosmological issues. So what I'm trying to say is that the Buddha's teachings are still very relevant and useful to those who are interested in psychology and matters of mental health without any spiritual dimension. So this practical approach requires the methodology of observation. You just observe. You don't as Buddhist practitioners, we don't try to conceptualize. We just observe how does morality appear in our mental experience. What are its manifestations? And secondly, as we do have a standard definition of mental health, we try to examine how it relates to that. So, what kinds of morality they are, and how could they function to reinforce or to diminish our definition of standards of mental health. And the first thing that we can quite easily observe about, say, the origin of morality is that it already exists. It naturally exists as a human experience, even though it may have there may be some conditions for its experience in an individual and social level. Nevertheless, almost everybody experiences a certain sense of morality or a sense of conscience. What these conditions contribute is what kind of morality, what kind of conscience. But the moral experience itself seems to be very natural, and say the capacity for moral experiences already exists. This is a natural dimension of our mental experience, of our emotional experience, and so forth. That's all that we observe here, that it already exists. That we cannot really investigate any farther where it comes from. It seems to be an inherent, it clearly is an inherent dimension of our mental experience as human beings. And that is something that distinguishes us, the human mental experience from other creatures like animals. They don't seem to have any or that level or that capacity for moral experience, say like a sense of conscience. The second thing that we observe about our capacity for moral experience is that by investigating the consequences of our moral experience, first of all, how does it work? How does it function? And secondly, what are its consequences? So when we speak about consequences here, it means in reference to or in relation to our definition, our understanding, and our standards of mental health. And in that sense, we can easily speak about good and bad morality. Good and bad here is not good and bad in itself, is not an opinion, is not a belief, but only good and bad with reference to what we conceive to be, what we believe to be mental health. And so good here can be understood as conducing to mental health in a Buddhist sense, conducing to Nibbana in a cosmological sense. And bad is the opposite of that. It's conducing away from mental health and away from Nibbana. And that again shows the importance of having a certain purpose or goal or context which allows us to categorize morality in this way. If we don't have that context, if we don't have that sense of purpose and the clarity of purpose, it's not possible to make any such categorization of good and bad morality. We don't even call it good and bad in the Buddhist language. In Pali we use kusala and akusala, and these terms really not so easy to translate, but kusala means conducing to, and akusala means conducing away, is conducing to the purpose and conducing away from the purpose. That's the difference. That's how we can understand the consequences of morality or moral experience. And finally, we through these observations, first is that morality can only be understood and investigated in relation to our belief in a certain standard or definition of mental health and a certain possibility of cosmological emancipation. And secondly, that morality or the capacity for moral experience is obviously a natural and inherent dimension of our mental experience. And thirdly is that it is possible to identify um, um, useful or unuseful, or skillful or unskillful modes and kinds of morality, those which conduce to mental health and those which conduce away from mental health. When you look at these observations altogether, you find that morality or a sense of conscience is something that actually not only has a role to play in the development of mental health and spiritual experience, that it actually has a necessary role to play. The reason for that is that this moral experience is something that we will, that the mind will be exposed to one way or another. There is no avoiding of morality or a sense of morality or a sense of conscience, because it is inherent in us. It is natural. This is very important because it shows that if we don't pay attention to it, if we don't handle it, if we don't train that moral sense, if we don't exercise a certain measure of control and manipulation over it, then it might take us in a wrong direction. It might naturally become something that is conducing away from mental health and from our spiritual aspiration. And the necessity for paying attention and developing our moral experience is something that begins to appear as we actually develop it. So it's not just something that it's not an opinion here. It's not that the logical thing is see morality exists and therefore we must take care of it. But as we pay attention to it and begin to develop it in the context of the Buddhist practice, we soon begin to see how it really makes a difference. It becomes something that we're able to see in our own experience rather than just something that we believe in because it makes sense. But actually we begin to see that the more we are able to develop our moral sense and our sense of conscience, the more the effect of this appears. It begins to be something that we are able to investigate and verify in our own mental experience rather than something that we just believe in or read about or listen to in a talk like this. And secondly, as we also develop other aspects of the Buddhist practice, not just the moral one, but there are also the samadhi and there are many others. The development of attention and the development of understanding, investigation, and intuition. We begin to see that it's really necessary that the moral dimension of our mental experience is profoundly or has profound effect and can never be neglected, can never be viewed as something that is a conventional or and it's something that is that we develop in an early stage of our practice. It continues to be a very profound and significant dimension of our experience, and as we persevere in our practice, we begin to feel that there are even deeper, more and more deep levels of moral experience, and they just something that gains in significance, it gains in the role and the effect which it contributes to our overall capacity and experience of goal and experience of the practice leading to the goal. So it is not just something that is say sometimes it's viewed as a conventional layer of practice or of life of a human being. It actually has very profound psychological ramifications. And one of the ways I found this to be true was how the development of a moral sense or a sense of conscience immediately affects samadhi, immediately plays a role in the development of samadhi. And that you could say that a solid sense of conscience and the development of moral sense is necessary in order for the development of the attentive faculty of the mind, and is a necessary dimension of, or is a necessary support or condition for the development of samadhi, the development of attention, and the capacity to observe the mind, to turn the observational capacities of the mind on its own self. If there is a lot of say bad conscience, if there is a lot of guilt or shame, if there is the moral experience of a certain individual is say evolves in the wrong direction. Wrong here means not conducing to mental health, and it's full of guilt and shame and remorse and things like that. Then the attentive faculties of the mind become very difficult to master, very difficult to cultivate and manipulate. While if the moral experience of a certain individual evolves in the right direction, in a wholesome or skillful direction, then it becomes much more easy to develop the attentive